In this presentation, I'll be sharing some of the insights from the researches I've been doing on the minute books of the Northern Circuit of the Bar from 1763 to 1802. I'm in the process of preparing these for publication. I'm delighted to say that there's going to be a Selden Society volume in their supplemental series, and so of course I would value any comments or suggestions that you may have coming out of this presentation. These are the earliest minutes from the circuit records. They start with notebooks in 1763, and as far as I can tell, they're the earliest surviving records of any of the circuits. I'm going to present some of the insights that these records can give us about those people who were at the bar on circuit during these 40 years and how being on the circuit fitted into their career progressions. I referred to these records as minutes, which makes them sound very formal, but they're essentially records of a dining society with occasional moments of dealing with professional matters, but relatively occasional. The minute books actually start off as records of wages because some of them require determination sometime in the future, for example, which of two people gets married first. The reason the circuit cares about these is because the loser of the bet had to pay in wine, and the wine was going to be drunk on circuit. So it turns out that barristers of the 18th century really did pay as much attention to ensuring a regular supply of alcohol as they do today. The Northern Circuit in the 18th century consisted of Yorkshire, Durham, Northumberland, Cumberland, Westmoreland and Lancashire. Those barristers who went on circuit went round typically all of those towns. There were also quarter sessions in towns such as Hull, Manchester and Liverpool, and other towns which were legal centres because of local courts which had recorders or where there were manor courts and so on. The barristers on circuit were a mix of barristers who lived and worked in London who went out on circuit, and that was literally that. The judges went round the country and the barristers who wanted to appear in the assize courts followed the same route at the same time. And also there were members of the circuit who lived and worked in the north of England and who did not follow the judges. They joined bar dinners only when the circuit came to their town. In some cases, they would travel to other assize towns. The minute book themselves are notebooks which were clearly prepared at the dinners as they took place. The evidence of this is the extensive wine staining, which demonstrates quite clearly the quality of sobriety in the people taking the notes. The circuit records start in 1763, although the circuit itself was much older. However, there was a general dip in litigation in the mid-18th century and a dip in the number of barristers, and it looks as though the circuit numbers had shrunk as well. I should say, in terms of this wider picture in the 18th century, the source for my information is David Lemming's fabulous book, Professors of the Law, which is a masterful survey of the state of the bar in the 18th century. And you'll see in a few places, one of the things that the circuit records allow me to do is compare for the Northern Circuit some of the figures that David Lemmings has assembled for the bar as a whole during that period. At the start of the books, they list those who relate to particular items of business. From 1777, they list all attendance at Grand Court. Grand Court was the main dinner. It took place in Lancaster and York, so twice the circuit. And then there were also what were called special courts. There was a general expectation that all barristers on circuit would attend bar mess. Those who were on circuit but did not attend were fined, also nominally in wine, although it's clear later on that that could be replaced by a cash equivalent. Occasionally they were excused for some good reason, such as ill health. Sometimes barristers are fined even where they haven't actually attended the circuit at all. So analysis of the numbers on circuit is based on those who are actually listed as attending dinners rather than those who are excused unless they appear at a later dinner on the same circuit, because those who are excused weren't necessarily on the circuit at all. And the dinners themselves largely involve a lot of silliness, as you'd expect from a bunch of drunk 18th century barristers. But they also show things like when people get some sort of post or office or professional recognition, usually because they're then congratulated, which means they have to pay some wine into the kitty, or the cost of wine. What's notable is that, although to start with the records are rather patchy, by 1768 it's already listing about 30 people during the course of a year, and that's not necessarily everybody. The 1770s typically have about 20 people at a dinner. From the 1780s this number increases to over 40, and by 1790 there are typically more than 50 on circuit each year. The maximum I have so far is 1794 with 64 persons. That is to say, 64 persons who at some point in the year attended Circuit Grand Court. And there might be a few more on circuit who don't actually attend mess. Here's the graph showing attendance at circuit dinners, and as you can see there's a notable increase, even allowing for the spotty nature of the early records. The next slide is a chart showing individual attendance. As you can see, quite a lot of barristers attend just in 1 or 2 years, perhaps just one circuit. These are often very junior barristers. Indeed, most barristers, when they first appear on circuit, are of recent call. A reasonable number stay on circuit for quite a few years, and then there are a number who attend for quite some years. The highest I've got so far is 31 years, though there may be some where their first attendances predate the minutes. So you can see that for some barristers, being on circuit was a lifelong part of their career, up until the point when either they retire or, for example, they take judicial office. This was a mix, as I said before, of those who lived in the north and those who came from London. There's no particular split that I can see for the longest attending people as to whether they actually live in the north or come from London. You find both in those who attend for a long time. Often those who make a very good living at the bar based in London end up moving on to better things, but not always, and sometimes they are on circuit for quite a long time. As well as the minutes, I've had access to some corroborating sources of information. The most interesting one is that there is a manuscript at Lincoln's Inn Library from a gentleman called Fletcher Raincock, who was a member of the Northern Circuit from 1794 onwards, which was the year he was called to the bar, until at least 1835, and probably until he died in 1840. This manuscript appears to come from 1835 because it goes up to 1833. And the manuscript is essentially a spreadsheet showing all members of the circuit and their dates of attendance. This ties in with a transcript notebook. So there's a notebook with the original minutes where someone has written out the first 5 volumes with occasional notes. It's not actually got an identified author, but the author's initials are FR. And so the fact that Fletcher Raincock did this is a pretty sure bet that this is the same person, because I did exactly the same thing when I started looking at the minute books with the modern equivalent. And you can see on Raincock's manuscript there are dots by year, and on my spreadsheet there are dots by year. So that's been extremely helpful. This period is also when the law lists start. So the law lists start in 1775 and run to 1801. They gradually become more complete. The early lists don't list the circuit at all. The first ones that list them list only the leaders. In the 1780s, they list 6 or 8 barristers when they're actually well over 30 on any circuit. Even when the law lists are more complete in the 1790s, they're still not correct. For example, the 1790 law list lists 51 counsel on the Northern Circuit, most with London addresses. It includes 12 who do not appear at mess that year at all of whom have been on the circuit, and they may consider themselves still affiliated. Others may just be out of date. There are 22 barristers who attend Grand Court that year who are not listed. Now, some are very junior and are not yet in the list at all, or just attend for 1 year, but others are regular attendees for some years. So the lists are therefore neither complete nor accurate. That's quite important because Lemmings uses them and others use them as a source of information, and it's very helpful to know that they're actually not complete or accurate. There are also some individual records where archives have papers relating to a barrister. There are some court records. I have, for example, seen the Clerk's Minute books for the Crown cases on circuit. This excludes Durham and Lancaster. Durham and Lancaster were Palatinate courts for the County Palatine of Durham and Lancaster. The County Palatine of Durham was governed by the Bishop of Durham, and the County Palatine of Lancaster lives with the Crown because the Queen is the Duke of Lancaster, and there's a duchy apparatus and a County Palatine apparatus, and so these had a separate jurisdiction. So effectively all cases in the Palatinate courts were recorded separately, even though effectively they were operated by judges come from the centre, same judges doing the same work. The records for the other counties list barristers who attended on Crown cases only, the ones I've found in the Public Record Office, so not civil cases, and most criminal cases did not feature counsel. There's occasional exceptions. But there are a steady stream of indictments for disrepair of roads, where that was how you enforced the parish council's obligation to repair roads, and these often included counsel. What these add are some names from the 1750s and 1760s. From about 1770, they don't list anyone who doesn't appear in the circuit records, which itself is useful to know, because that means that everybody who appears in court was going to mess. Other judicial records of cases are a bit more sporadic, because it's rather chance if they happen to cover a case on circuit. The other source of information is the records of the Inns of Court. Inns of Court admission records and call records survive. They're not always completely accurate, because there are occasional people who are, for example, called to the bar, but there's no record of them being admitted to the inn. But what this does show for most barristers is how senior they were. The age of someone when they're called isn't always the same. It depends whether they've been to university and what their background is, but it is the start of their barrister career. In addition, when an individual is admitted to an inn, their father's occupation and place of origin are usually given, and sometimes if they have a degree. There are about 230 barristers mentioned in the minute books for this period. The approximate split of barristers by their Inn of Court is as follows: 40 Greys, 91 Lincolns, 46 Inner, 51 Middle. And as you can see, I've done some work which shows David Lemming's figures for the whole of the bar, all barristers called by those inns from 1750 to 1800. In fact, he does the early part of the 18th century as well, compared to the total numbers for the Northern Circuit for those periods. Overall, about 12% of barristers are on the Northern Circuit, and whereas Lincoln's Inn, Inner and Middle Temple are not far off that as an overall average, with slightly more at Lincoln's Inn, it's notable that Gray's Inn is twice that. This is the bottom left figure, which is the percentage of members of each inn who are Northern Circuit for each period. And then flip to the right, and what you can see is the percentage of Northern Circuit members at each inn, and that shows again figures that for Lincoln's, Middle and Inner are not a long way off the overall average, slightly down on Middle, slightly up on Lincoln's. Lincoln's by the end of the 18th century was by far the largest inn, but again about twice as many at Gray's Inn, national average 17% rather than 8%, and for some periods significantly more. Since the circuit records only start in 1763, 1750 to 1760 is a little bit less reliable. It shows only those who are still attending 10 years later, rather than junior people who might have gone on circuit. I've also tallied the place of origin of all those on the circuit. This doesn't allow for the possibility that some from the north of England went to London and joined the bar and stayed there. But since going on circuit was a very standard way to get started as a junior barrister, and since most of those with a local connection used it when they chose a circuit, I would think that there would not have been a large number of barristers from the north who did not go on circuit. Anecdotally, for example, from those who became judges, there were a few. For example, Lord Eldon, Scott, was on circuit, but his brother Lord Stowell was not, although these are by definition high flyers and so may not have needed a circuit career to get started. Okay, so what this table shows is the geographical origin of Northern Circuiteers. And as you can see, the largest proportion comes from Yorkshire, which is about a little under a third of all Northern Circuiteers. Though bear in mind that Yorkshire at this period is all 3 ridings. Today that's actually 4 counties, and includes Leeds, York, Hull, Sheffield. Lancashire includes Liverpool. Manchester's only just starting to become the centre of an industrialised area. There are also notably some from Scotland who moved to England, and a number from London who decided to head up north to try and seek their fortune. I've then considered the extent to which those on circuit who come from the north have any preference as to which inn they join. Was there any particular connection between people from the north and any particular one of the Inns of Court? Overall, the largest proportion of Northern Circuit members was from Lincoln's Inn, which matched the bar as a whole. But it's notable that from those from Gray's Inn, 87.5%, that's all but 5, of those Northern Circuit members at Gray's Inn actually came from the north. 76% at Middle Temple and less for the others. So what we see is that most Northern Circuit members came from the north, but that was particularly pronounced at Gray's Inn. It's also notable that Gray's Inn had a significant number of treasurers from the Northern Circuit. For the period 1770 to 1830, which covers the careers of people I'm talking about, they had 18 treasurers from the north, plus 3 who did more than one term, so a total of 24 out of 60, so just a little under half. And All but one of the treasurers who came from the north were on the Northern Circuit. There's only one who was from Northumberland and is not listed as a member of the Northern Circuit. So that confirms that most northern barristers would go on the Northern Circuit. This comes up the other way as well. What this slide shows is the overall split between the inns in terms of where Northern Circuit members pick. So the bar overall, again this is Lemmings figures, it's 31% Middle Temple, 36% Lincoln's, 25% Inner Temple and 8% Gray's Inn. As you can see, Gray's Inn was significantly smaller. And for Lancashire, apologise for the fact the colours have gone adrift between the two diagrams. But for Lancashire, you can see that the proportions are not a long way off. Slightly more at Inner Temple, slightly less at Lincoln's Inn, bang on for Middle Temple, and much the same with Gray's Inn. Yorkshire, it's quite different. 30% of Yorkshire barristers who go to the Northern Circuit go to Gray's Inn. 33% to Lincoln's, much like average, slightly down at Middle and quite a lot down at Inner. So there's clearly a link between Gray's Inn and Yorkshire. What that tells us is just something interesting about the connections that could grow up between different parts of the country and different inns of court. I've done a short breakdown for those who attended university. Over the period for the North, about 60% did not attend university. This is not so uncommon. Out of 228 people for whom I've been able to identify their university status, 50 were at Cambridge, 36 at Oxford, small number in Scotland and one in Dublin. David Lemmings has some sample years for university attendance, and he has a sample 1769 to 1771, and I've compared the figures for Northern Circuit from the same few years. And what you see is that the attendance at Cambridge is very similar to the overall average at the bar, but the attendance at Oxford is significantly fewer, and there are more not going to university at all. So this suggests that Cambridge was about as attractive to prospective barristers from the north as it was for the rest of the country, but Oxford was less attractive. And as you can see, when you look at place of origin over the whole period I'm looking at, 74% of Cambridge students were from the north, whereas only 47% of Oxford and 25% were from London. So what we have is more of those from London going to Oxford, and some of those deciding that they would give the North a go. We also have some things we can say about career progression. The records note, as I've said, progression such as local recorderships, Duchy and Palatine officers, as well as national officers such as King's Counsel or Sergeant, election to Parliament and government or judicial office. And of course, these are all matters about which there are extensive records. And the Duchy and Palatinate officers for Lancashire were closely connected to the circuit. By the end of the 18th century, it was usual for the leader of the circuit to hold the office of Attorney General of the County Palatine of Lancashire. The leader is not itself an office of the circuit, and so not identified in the minutes as such, but it was quite clear at the time that people would know who the leader of the circuit was. Out of the 228 people on the Northern Circuit during this period, even if only briefly, there are 37 judges, and I've set them out there. The 2 Lord Chancellors, Eldon and Loughborough, 8 Common Pleas judges, which is reasonable proportion, about a quarter of the Common Pleas judges, much smaller proportion of King's Bench judges, 1 Chief Justice, Lord Ellenborough, reasonable proportion of Barons of the Exchequer, only 1 Master of the Rolls, only 1 Admiralty judge, and 5 Masters in Chancery. Now, Master of the Rolls, the equity bar at this period tended not to go on circuit, so that's not altogether a huge surprise. And the Admiralty judge, that was Lord Stowell, who didn't go on the circuit very much. He attends once or twice. Then you get into local judges. So there were 7 who were Welsh, Scottish or Irish judges, which were generally perceived as having a lesser status. 1 Deemster of the Isle of Man, 1 Chief Justice of Ely and 8 colonial judges. There were 47 town recorders, mostly in the north. And then you get a certain number of JPs, other local judges, smaller effectively county courts. Law officers, there are 9 Attorneys General for this period, so that's quite a reasonable proportion. You could clearly be on the Northern Circuit and get somewhere in politics, plus some Attorney Generals of lesser officers like the Isle of Man, Queen and the Prince of Wales. 53 are MPs, so that's nearly a quarter. There's also a connection between those who are King's Counsel or Patent of Precedence. Again, this is something I've picked up from Lemmings, who identifies it generally. So there are 30 King's Counsel, Sergeant or Patent of Precedent during the period. Patent of precedent is effectively equivalent to King's Counsel. 2/3 of the KCs became MPs, and all of those who had a patent of precedence. A patent of precedence usually had a political dimension and often King's Counsel. But that's not true for sergeants, that's the senior barristers in the Court of Common Pleas. Only 1 out of 8 became an MP. There are some details in the handout of some of the other ways in which careers progressed. That takes me to the end of my 20 minutes. On the presentation there are also some slides of some individuals showing how all of this fitted together, and I want to mention in particular Judge Park, who's going to be mentioned later. I hope you found that interesting, and thank you very much indeed.